There have been many close calls in the world of aviation safety, but few are as ridiculous and surprising as the curious case of British Airtours Flight 101. An enormous wide-body passenger plane carrying over 400 people is left teetering on the edge of a hill, meters from absolute disaster. The investigation that followed would expose shortcomings in the process by which the United Kingdom certified certain aircraft parameters and the tight margins that can exist within the country's relationship with its regional airports, operating large airplanes on short runways. Those same delicate margins meant to ensure safe operations can easily, in the right circumstances, become eroded with enormous consequences. How easy is it for things to slip away? Some airports can barely offer enough room, and all it takes is just one bad day. The sunny Balearic island of Palma de Mallorca has been attracting tourists for decades. The year-round warm climate, the sandy beaches, and a lively culture has kept visitors coming back year after year. Since the 1960s, the tourism industry here had been growing steadily, similar to a plethora of other destinations all over the Mediterranean, correlating with the rise of regular air travel. By the 1980s, a growing trend across much of Europe meant that more people than ever could afford international travel, and prices for holidays here were comparatively cheap. The package holiday has long been the delight of British tourists, and Mallorca is only a 2-hour flight from London. For British holidaymakers, especially families looking for those cheap getaways, Mallorca has always been a popular destination. For most holidays, a Mallorca vacation usually begins and ends here, at Aeropuerto de Palma de Mallorca. Serving tens of millions of passengers annually, the airport is amongst the busiest in Spain, especially during the summer season. Capitalizing on the booming holiday market in the twilight of the 20th century, various airlines jumped at the chance to cash in on charter services, meaning lending their planes out to accommodate travel on behalf of others, i.e. tour operators or travel agents. British Airways of the United Kingdom was no exception. In fact, the airline had inherited a charter subsidiary from the 1974 consolidation of BOAC and British European Airways, which manifested in British Airtours, which became the holiday charter arm of British Airways. To help bolster the charter business in the 1980s, British Airways transferred a number of their Lockheed L-1011 TriStar airplanes over to Airtours, which at the time only had a modest fleet of Boeing 737 aircraft at the start of the decade. This brings us nicely over to the morning of Monday, the 27th of May, 1985. The TriStar, registered as Golf Bravo Bravo Alpha India, had arrived at Palma de Mallorca in the late morning following a flight from London Gatwick. As the jetway attaches and the doors open, passengers disembark. It was an ordinary day. Of course, dropping off holidaymakers only means there are hundreds to pick up again going home. However, the plane is not scheduled to return to Gatwick. The aircraft will be flying as British Airtours Flight 101, service to Leeds Bradford. As the clock strikes midday, 398 passengers are boarding the TriStar this afternoon. On the flight deck today is a crew of 3. Their backgrounds discussed here are based on the contents of the official accident report. However, in this case, the names of the pilots have not been recorded. It does appear, though, that all of these pilots worked for British Airways, BEA, or BOAC before being assigned onto the Airtours division. Acting as pilot in command is a 41-year-old captain with 10,000 flight hours behind him. He comes from a long, truly British aviation background, having piloted de Havilland Comets and Hawker Siddeley Tridents. The co-pilot, a 43-year-old acting as first officer, is similarly experienced with over 9,000 total flight hours. He previously flew Boeing 707s and 747s before transitioning to the TriStar. There is also a third pilot on board, acting as the flight engineer, a younger gentleman at 34 with around 4,000 hours logged. To be clear, he was a British Airtours pilot, but the TriStar did require 3 people to fly, and someone has to occupy the flight engineer station behind the co-pilot. It's a busy day for the 3 men. They are going to be shuffling up and down between Britain and Palma all day, and the flight to Leeds is only their second in the day's schedule. The plane's roster after arriving in Leeds is to fly back to Mallorca with a return to Luton. That same plane is then expected to complete yet another rotation to the island, finally returning to Gatwick in the evening. Now, these pilots may well have been acquainted with their base airport at Gatwick, but none of them have flown into Leeds before. All of them will be flying here for the first time. The British Airtours operating manual listed Leeds Bradford as a Category A airfield, meaning the airport presents no special difficulty. It's a key detail that's worth keeping in mind for the rest of this journey. With boarding complete and with a total of 14 crew members flying today, including the pilots, there are a total of 412 souls on board. This is a staggering number of passengers for an L1011. In fact, British Airtours TriStars, from what I can ascertain from my research, had one of the highest density configurations of this aircraft in its history. It varies depending on the specific aircraft model. There were 3 main variants of the passenger TriStar, but at its extreme, the plane had an exit limit of 400, and BA Airtours pushed their TriStars towards this upper limit. A fact made possible in the first place thanks to Lockheed installing a large kitchen occupying the lower deck, with a small elevator with just enough room for a flight attendant or a trolley, allowing for easy transport between the 2 decks. This meant a conventional galley didn't take up as much floor space, allowing for a higher seating capacity. The TriStar truly was a plane that was more than meets the eye. Serving to increase the passenger count because the airline catered to holiday services, often accommodating families, the higher passenger numbers on these flights can also be accounted in the presence of lap passengers, small children riding with their parents. Back on the flight deck, the pilots are finishing up their pre-flight checks. The flight engineer is monitoring systems, the captain inputting waypoints into the aircraft's inertial navigation system, or INS. Though it could only hold 9 waypoints and pilots often had to daisy chain them together, it will guide the plane all the way to Yorkshire. At 12:21 in the afternoon local time, British Airtours Flight 101 departs Palma heading north for Britain. Overwhelmingly, the majority of this flight was uneventful. The plane cruised as normal, soaring high on its way to Leeds. Re-entering British airspace, the Airtours crew now turn their attention to their approach. As we have mentioned, none of the pilots have flown into Leeds before, so they review their charts and request weather information for the airport. Over in Leeds, the weather is not exactly ideal flying weather. It's cloudy and rain showers have been on and off all day. As Flight 101 approaches from the south, the airport is subject to another typical British downpour. Our pilots today may not have been too familiar with the airport in the moment, but we, 40 years later, are going to become very familiar with Leeds Bradford during the course of this video, so it's time that we took a closer look at this little airport in the Yorkshire countryside. This is Leeds Bradford Airport as it is officially known. It has 1 runway, historically 3, but those were withdrawn from service over the years. This is the main runway here, marked runway 1432. Even in the 1980s, this was the main, normal runway. The terminal is situated on the northeast side of the airport, with the main apron extending through the eastern side of the field. In 1984, the main runway was extended from 1,646 meters to 2,250 meters, bringing it to the length to which it remains to this day. This extension was done in part to facilitate the accommodation of larger planes like the Lockheed L1011 TriStar. In fact, following this extension, regular transatlantic flights commenced for the first time from the airport, and the new runway could accommodate aircraft like the Boeing 747 and even Concorde. This meant that at the newer length, most planes, including the TriStar, could now use the airport, but the runway for these larger planes is still comparatively short compared to the likes of London Heathrow, Gatwick, or Manchester, airports that British TriStar pilots are more likely to frequent. Of the airport's many quirks, the runway orientation is a little curious in and of itself. Normally, airports in the north of Britain have a northeast to southwest orientation to take advantage of the prevailing winds. However, the runway at Leeds Bradford is rather antithetical to this, being situated in the exact opposite, which often results in crosswind situations, which is something that pilots need to keep in mind. It turns out, though, that on the 27th of May 1985, wind conditions actually favoured the runway, or at least the wind wasn't as much of an issue that day. Weather information was passed over to the British Airtours crew. The Leeds controller gave them winds of 190 at 5 knots with suitable visibility conditions, and they notified them of a rain shower that had just passed over the airport. The runway was wet, and though runway 14 was in use, it did have its drawbacks. For one thing, the preferred approach, that is, using the ILS, Instrument Landing System, was not available on runway 14. Only runway 32 had full ILS, forcing the pilots into a surveillance radar approach. But not only that, part of the reason the runway orientation is the way that it is in part due to the fact that the terrain of the area is not exactly flat, and suitable areas to construct an airport here were limited in the first place. Leeds itself is quite hilly, and the airport is basically situated in the foothills of the Pennines. When that runway extension was commissioned, it was a surprisingly large infrastructure project for the area, requiring the runway to now pass over a major roadway, and a lot of land had to be created to bring certain areas up to the elevation of the airport to facilitate the expansion. What you're left with is a runway that has noticeable drop-offs at each end. Beyond both runway 32 and runway 14 are embankments that slope down. Then consider that the runway itself is also not flat. Now, plenty airports have slopes and gradients, there's nothing new there, but runway 14 at Leeds has this noticeable initial downslope that begins right at the foot of the paved area. Based on altitude above sea level, the start of the paved area of the whole runway from this northern end begins at an elevation of around 684 feet. The runway then slopes down to 656 feet in the center of the runway, raising back up again to 667 feet, and then sloping back down to 659 at the southerly end of the runway. So, runway 32 also had its own bumpy characteristics in that regard. Now, in isolation, this isn't dangerous by any stretch. It is rather tame compared to extreme examples. Runway 14 did require the addition of a displaced threshold to comply with unobstructed approach slope requirements. These spaces can exist for any number of reasons, often to consider terrain obstacles or buildings or even noise restrictions. They are there to facilitate a steady, unobstructed approach slope whilst complying with safe clearance margins. But the displaced threshold cannot be used for touching down on. It can be used for taxiing, takeoff, or landing rollout, but not for touchdown. In fact, there is a dedicated space on the runway for that. It's called the touchdown zone, which is indicated by those distinctive markings. That's the part of the runway the pilots are aiming for on landing, so whilst the overall length of the paved surface here is 2,250 meters, runway 14 only has an available landing distance of 1,802 meters. For a plane to safely arrive at the airport, that aircraft must be able to slow down and stop within that distance. Consider for a second that a plane will not touch down exactly at the front of that usable area. The TriStar, as an absolute minimum, at least for our aircraft, needs 1,740 meters. With the available landing distance of 1,802 and the fully paved area of 2,250 meters, this shouldn't be a problem, right? A short runway, sure, but not particularly dangerous, or at least not on its own. Beginning their descent back into England, the workload of the pilots begins to increase. At 1:16 in the afternoon local time, BKT-101 establishes contact with air traffic control in Leeds. Now about 15 miles southwest of the airport, they emphasize that runway 14 is in use. Flight 101 will fly north past the airport and ATC will give them a new heading to intercept the final approach course for the runway, about 7 to 8 miles out. Given the short and wet runway consideration, the captain instructs the co-pilot to apply a high reverse thrust setting of 90% immediately upon touchdown. However, at no point during the approach briefing is there any mention of those runway slopes. It wasn't necessarily a requirement to discuss. Lining up with runway 14, the crew are kind of slow to configure the plane for landing. They only enter the final descent glide at 5 miles from touchdown with an indicated airspeed of 185 knots. Slowly, the flaps and landing gear are brought out to create drag, but the TriStar's auto-throttle function is still engaged. The autopilot has been controlling the thrust for most of the flight based on selected airspeeds. With less than 1 minute before landing, the captain calls for the next stage of flap, 22 degrees, and he closes the throttle manually to assist with slowing. With the airspeed dropping, the last few stages of flap are called out, 28, 33, and finally 42 degrees, which was selected at an altitude of around 560 feet above the runway elevation, around 36 seconds from touchdown. But the flaps need time to transit to their final state, where they were fully extended at a height of 466 feet. This is not to say that the approach was rushed, so much as it is to highlight the late configuration of the aircraft. Regardless, they need to create more drag and slow the plane down. Transitioning through 400 down to 100 feet, the thrust control is handed back to the autothrottle before properly being disconnected, just meters before passing over the runway threshold. In the final seconds of the flight, the third pilot, the flight engineer, calls out altitude markers to the captain. 50, 40, 30. The captain now flares his aircraft in preparation for touchdown. But how much are you willing to bet that everything begins to fall apart the very instant those wheels touch the runway? The TriStar touches down firmly. Immediately, the co-pilot selects the reverse thrust, bringing it up to the 90% setting as per their briefing. They have only been on the ground for maybe 4 seconds when the captain catches a glimpse of something that troubles him. The runway at Leeds Bradford has a series of lights built into the runway itself, like most commercial airports. All of the runway lights were illuminated at the time of the accident. The runway centerline lights change from white to red as they approach the end of the runway. Specifically, in the range from 900 to 300 meters from the end, they alternate between white and red, and then fully red for the rest. Our captain, only seconds after touchdown, notices that the red centerline lights are creeping up on the aircraft very quickly. The swift conclusion there is that they are rapidly running out of runway. In response, he immediately hammers the brakes. Startled, he announces, "Gosh, the red lights come quickly, don't they?" In that very next moment, the captain felt a wave of horror sweep over him, his heart dropping like a stone, horrified to discover that even though he is pressing on the brakes as hard as he can, the speed indicator is slow to move, almost as if the brakes are not cooperating. The plane is still speeding down the runway at around 130 knots with little deceleration, and only around 1,000 meters of usable runway left. "I've got my feet on the brakes as far as I can," he shouts. Sensing the unraveling situation, the co-pilot with his left hand on the throttle controls brings the reverse thrust up to 100%. Very slowly, the plane begins to decelerate, 120 knots, down through 110. With every passing second, the enormous trijet eats up more precious runway. They have to stop in time. Beyond the end of runway 14 is a drop-off that ends in a wooded area. As they drop below 100 knots, there is only 460 meters of runway remaining. But then, just when it feels like the plane is beginning to slow down, that rate of deceleration is halted for a moment and wouldn't return for another 150 meters. The upward sloping runway around this area does assist slightly, and speed reduces to 75 knots, but it now becomes clear that the plane won't stop on the runway in time. With around 300 meters remaining, an overrun is inevitable. They have less runway to stop the TriStar than is available at the shortest runway in the world in Saba. It is an impossible task. The captain sees the tippy end of the runway fast approaching. He takes decisive action. By this point, he knows he's going off the end of it, but between them and a potential resting point are the runway approach lights for runway 32. He wants to avoid them if he can, so he reaches down to the tiller which controls the nose landing gear, and he swings it to the left as hard as he can. The TriStar veers, swinging to the left. Passengers and flight attendants feel the sudden change, but for those sitting by the windows, they would have watched as the paved area runs out as the TriStar now goes onto the grass. Only 10 meters separates the end of the runway with the downward embankment. The main wheel bogies sink slightly into the grass, creating troughs in their wake. However, even with a reduced speed of 30 knots, this was not enough to bring the plane to a halt before the embankment. The pilots brace themselves as the nose goes over the ridge. Pitching downward 14 degrees, the nose gear collapses, bending backwards in on the aircraft, striking the internal walls of the cargo compartment. It generates a loud bang that reverberates throughout the plane. The main landing gear now holds the plane in the grass towards the top of the embankment, and the massive jet suddenly comes to a halt. The Leeds tower controller watched the whole thing. They immediately pick up the phone to notify emergency services, and rather incredibly, the controller even managed to capture the landing on film. That recording would later be handed over to the official investigation, but has never been seen since. It takes a moment for the crew to come to their senses as to what has just happened. They can't see it yet, but their massive plane is teetering on the edge of a hill. But they have one thing on their minds right now: shut down the plane and get out. The captain picks up the intercom and orders an immediate evacuation. The flight attendants spring into action, opening the doors where the slides activate. However, the TriStar's engines are still running. In the cockpit, the captain orders the shutdown procedures. By accident, the co-pilot pulled the flap lever retracting the flaps, though he immediately redeploys them back to the 42-degree position. As the fuel is shut off to the engines and they begin spooling down, over 400 passengers and crew exit the aircraft down the slides and onto the grass. Remarkably, the pilots, flight attendants, and rescuers are able to account for every last person that was on board. Some minor injuries were recorded during the evacuation process, but everyone managed to escape within 90 seconds, without so much as a broken leg. Investigators from Britain's Air Accidents Investigation Branch, or AAIB, were swiftly notified and arrived on scene later that day. In the hours and days after the accident, the plane did just sort of sit there on the hill, dominating the local skyline, and it was like this for a while. The sight of the plane left nearby residents a bit confused. Local news crews turned up to document the scene, and people gathered taking photographs with the aircraft. It's certainly not something you see every day. And here's the thing, how can you blame them? This does look a little silly. I mean, just look at it. How did the plane end up like this? Well, I'm so glad you asked, because that is certainly an interesting question indeed. Though this was a non-fatal accident, the fact that a massive wide-body passenger plane went off of the runway like this was still within reason to consider this a major incident, especially when you realize just how close the plane came to absolute catastrophe. If the TriStar had just a bit more speed or landed just a little bit further down the runway, this could have been very bad. It was important for investigators to establish the facts behind it, so right off of the bat, what do we think? Well, you and me can probably both gauge that the short, wet runway might have had something to do with it. However, saying the runway was wet, therefore the plane skidded onto the grass, kind of isn't a good enough answer, at least for me, because there is a lot of detail here that is worth exploring. The TriStar was rated for landing at Leeds Bradford. The plane itself had demonstrated its performance during wet runway trials. The UK Civil Aviation Authority and British Airways signed off on this. By the book, The aircraft, wet runway or otherwise, should have been able to slow down, and none of this should have been an issue in the first place. It rains all of the time in Britain. In fact, it is raining right now as I am recording this. Look, something went wrong here, and either something happened to the plane, someone or some people made a mistake somewhere down the line, or someone's lying. Let's discuss. Here comes the airplane. First, we should consider the aircraft itself. The TriStar had been substantially damaged in the accident. Not only was the nose landing gear destroyed, but that also caused damage to the internal cargo compartment. The cowlings of the two wing-mounted engines also received some damage as they had been flattened on the bottoms, which also contributed to some ingestion of earth material. However, all of this damage, for what it's worth, was the result of the plane going over the edge, as it were, and had nothing to do with why that happened. Of course, investigators examined the plane as it rested on the embankment, but it did have to be recovered. They couldn't just leave it there. The only way this was possible was by pulling it back up the embankment again, with the plane then being propped up on a stand on account of broken nose wheels. The black box flight recorders were removed from the plane and they were pretty much in mint condition. It wasn't exactly a violent accident after all. That said, the quality of the cockpit voice recording was very poor. Only small pieces of it could be deciphered, which would later prompt a recommendation calling for a review of CVRs on UK aircraft. The flight data recorder, on the other hand, gave a full clear readout. So, what did investigators have to say about the health of the plane? Well, once they got the TriStar out of the grass and they tested the plane's electrics, air systems, and hydraulic flight controls, the plane was found to be in relatively good condition with no apparent systems failure. The plane flew all the way from Palma with no reason to suspect a major flaw with the aircraft. Likewise, the spoilers and reverse thrust, two key components for slowing down on landing, were clearly deployed as normal. Evidently though, the plane had issues slowing down. If an airplane overruns for reasons not readily clear, the brakes are probably, if not suspect number one, are likely a high priority for scrutiny. The Lockheed L-1011 TriStar has an adaptive braking system that could regulate brake pressure to maintain optimal braking regardless of the friction conditions of the runway, i.e. dry or wet, or the materials of the runway itself, i.e. concrete, asphalt, or whatever. The TriStar has 4 hydraulic systems. System B and System C can both be used for the brakes. Whichever is selected, brake pressure would be applied individually to a set of 8 wheels on the 2 bogies of the main undercarriage landing gear, 4 on each side. The nose wheel doesn't get brakes. The anti-skid system works as a modulator for brake pressure. When engaged, if a pilot demands brake pressure conducive to a skid, the anti-skid system regulates that, maintaining a maximum braking effectiveness. The TriStar's flight data recorder did not record brake application, unfortunately, so there was no recorded data to show the brake functionality during the crisis itself. However, no evidence suggested a fault here either. I mean, the brakes clearly did work, the plane obviously slowed down, but for some reason it just wasn't enough. Now, if the plane is going to achieve its certified landing performance, especially at somewhere with a short runway like Leeds Bradford, the brakes should be applied as soon as the main wheels touch the ground, or as soon as reasonably possible anyway. But based on the recollection of the flight crew, the brakes on this occasion were applied roughly 4 seconds after this, which was a strategy the captain was more familiar with, as that closely aligned with what was described in his operating manual. The investigation, for a moment, did posit the idea that the captain perhaps didn't make proper use of the brakes. On this plane, a pilot needed to apply at least 20 pounds of pressure on the brake pedals for it to register, though the captain's recurrent training history and the toaster-quality cockpit voice recording made it clear that he knew what he was doing here, and the brakes, on their own, responded well to pilot input. That is to say, when the brakes were applied from the pedals, the plane did respond by applying pressure to the wheel set, which is interesting because in this accident, it's the relationship between the wheels and the ground surface that truly matters here. It's going to help if we can visualize this. Thankfully, based on the data from the flight data recorder, recollection from the flight crew, and the film of the landing that was captured from the perspective of an observer, a complete mapping of the landing can be constructed. So, let's do that. Here is runway 1432 at Leeds Bradford. Based on the flight data, the investigation pinpointed that the main landing gear touched down around here, leaving us with this much runway left. Now, we know that this runway has a total available landing distance of 1,802 meters. Remember, there is a displaced threshold that can't be used for touchdown, so the aircraft did land in the specified landing area. We can also map the ground speed of the aircraft as it travelled down the runway, so we can actually see the rate of deceleration more clearly. Obviously, a speed significantly greater than 0 was recorded at the end of it. This tells us that when the wheels touched the ground, the plane decelerated rather slowly. The captain quickly realizes that the runway was getting away from him as the aircraft didn't slow down as quickly as it should have. Even when the brakes were applied, the plane did not have a noticeable increase in the rate of deceleration, which makes it look like the wheels may have slipped or had poor friction with the runway, only picking up towards the end. If the brakes were applied as soon as the wheels touched the ground as opposed to 4 seconds after the fact, that would probably have had a negligible effect on the overall length of the landing roll, because braking effectiveness was already poor. Okay, let's back up for a moment. If we are saying the aircraft did not achieve the desired friction on the runway, the rain and perhaps the runway itself may be our culprits. But was it really that bad? A little fall of rain, did that really throw a massive plane like the TriStar off of the runway? Well, before we can answer that, we need to see if we can examine the other notable aspects of this landing, namely what happened just before touchdown and the slopes on the runway. How did they affect the landing? On final approach, the plane turned towards the runway with a relatively high airspeed, but this was reduced to within a reasonable region for landing, somewhere just above 150 knots. But this was a late configuration, and with that, the autothrottle remained engaged during the flap transit, so it compensated for that changing wing with only a short amount of time to touchdown. Even when the pilots had manually adjusted the thrust to the effect of lowering airspeed, the autothrottle still applied more thrust during the short time between when the crew returned the thrust management to the autothrottle and when it was eventually turned off just before touchdown. The result of this was a slightly higher airspeed at the runway threshold, about 8 knots above the reference for landing. It's significant enough that it's worth mentioning, but 8 knots either way was not really going to sway the outcome of the accident, and investigators did clear the captain of wrongdoing here on the grounds that the final stage of the approach was executed just fine, so let's look at that. At 30 feet above the runway threshold elevation, the captain began to execute his flare. That's where a pilot pulls the nose up slightly for a smooth landing. At the moment of the flare, the rate of descent started to decrease because, of course, the nose is raised, the pilot wants a smoother landing. But if you remember, we discussed that this runway has a sloping component. The runway slopes down at its beginning. Thresholds and overrun areas included, with the entirety of the paved area, this runway begins at an elevation slightly above 680 feet and slopes down nearly 30 feet into the center of the runway, which stands at its lowest at 656 feet. Now, over that distance, it really doesn't look like much, and Leeds Bradford honestly is not special in that regard. Many airports have runways that go up and down like this, especially in the UK. But its effects would have been measurable. You can imagine, can't you, how a slowing rate of descent on the flare, in combination with that downward gradient, may have the effect of extending the distance the plane will cover in the flare, compared to if that same runway were flat. This was a real concern for the investigation, as it may suggest a scenario where a plane arriving at an airport with tight margins, like say the massive TriStar at this small provincial airport, The concern being that initial downslopes could just immediately fail an aircraft's landing performance if the runway is short, and the pilots don't account for it. So, was this runway slope and flare conducive to wasting enough runway that they were now left with too little to stop? Well, based on a normal flare at 30 feet of altitude at the threshold, the investigation found that this downward slope could extend their distance from flare to touchdown by as much as 71 meters. Subtracting that from the total available landing distance, this leaves 1,731 meters, which, according to the investigation, is 9 meters too short for the TriStar at its then landing weight. It sounds like we might have an interesting development here, but hold your horses because there's more. The investigation cautioned in their final report on the accident that initial downslopes like this can erode safety margins if the conditions are right, or I guess wrong in this case. They emphasized that regulatory authorities should identify runway slopes and the importance of them in being factored into things like landing calculations. At the time, it technically wasn't a requirement for British pilots to do this. Here's the thing. With a flare and that downslope, we could reasonably expect from 30 feet at the threshold to touchdown for the plane to contact the runway about 550 meters beyond the threshold. That is, assuming the pilot doesn't account for the downslope. So, let's remind ourselves where Flight 101 touched down again. Here. 453 meters beyond the threshold. It was a firm landing. The pilot just slammed it in there, Ryanair style. Nothing beats a Jet 2 holiday. That is the wrong airline, Chloe. That's not correct. That's bad. Cut that. Although we can recognize that the downslope might have affected the landing distance available, the plane still kind of landed within that normal touchdown area, and therefore doesn't really explain why the TriStar couldn't stop. This leaves us with more room to explore that relationship between the ground and the aircraft. The key to understanding this accident comes down to whether or not the plane achieved the right level of friction with the runway. So, just how bad was it? The runway at Leeds Bradford was wet at the time of the accident. It wasn't raining, but a heavy rain shower did pass over in the preceding minutes. Water on a runway can have drastic effects on the friction characteristics between the aircraft and the ground. If water on the runway cannot drain, flow, or be squeezed away from the wheels, then that is going to manifest in reduced braking effectiveness, or even a hydroplaning situation where a layer of water separates the tyres from the runway. That's why it's important for runways to have macro texture options to help with this. A runway with a coarse texture with high roughness, or one with scores or grooves, can offer numerous channels for water to drain. Friction and texture are directly linked. A high-textured surface with many macroscopic irregularities, you would reasonably expect to translate into higher friction. Think running your hand over your kitchen counter versus your carpet. One produces more heat than the other. This means we have to discuss those characteristics of the Leeds Bradford runway. Runways are regularly measured and assessed for their friction. The runway at Leeds was, and still is, made of concrete. Much of the original runway constructed in 1965 was made of scored concrete, whilst the 1984 extension was made of brushed concrete. That newer brushed part of the runway was very coarse, whilst the original sections of scored concrete were smoother. In fact, much of the original scoring from the 1960s was observed by investigators as having become significantly worn down after nearly 20 years of use. When Flight 101 landed, because of that displaced threshold, the aircraft touched down at the very end of the brushed section, with most of the rollout taking place on this smoother surface. That said, assessments of friction levels on runway 1432 were carried out from time to time. Airports tend to employ some sort of special device that is driven up and down the runway at specific speeds to take measurements. Some airports do this by utilizing a specially made vehicle. Others, like at Leeds Bradford, measured this using a towed friction meter trailer. Depending on what exact tools are used and other variables such as the speed and when and where the measurements are taken, this would produce values on a scale between 0 and 1 being the theoretical maximum friction level. Certain airports may even employ recurrent measurements that can be transmitted to pilots if braking action is changing in inclement weather. But at Leeds that day, that didn't appear to be the case. The pilots were only informed the runway was wet, and they had no way to determine whether or not it was slippery. Results of testing between 1980 and 1985 showed that friction levels at Leeds were satisfactory for a concrete runway, albeit somewhat below average when compared to other UK airports. Now, these values are averages based on measurements taken at different locations on the runway, and they had large variances under wet conditions, but at no point did this cause concern. Nonetheless, measuring friction like this gives way to certain limitations. There are a lot of factors that can produce different results. The type of vehicle or trailer, its calibration, what speed it is traveling at, where and when the measurements are taken, and in the 1980s the reliability of this friction testing was poor. No ground vehicle or device used to measure friction could correlate to an aircraft, let alone a TriStar. This unreliability is how we wound up with friction measurements in 1980 returning values lower than later testing that coalesced above 0.60. Investigators couldn't explain that, putting that down to a limitation of the method. But that said, texture measurements of the runway were very smooth. Texture here meaning the roughness of the runway. The International Civil Aviation Organization recommends that, at least for new runways, that the texture depth should be no less than 1 mm. But when the runway texture was measured after the accident, the entire runway fell far short of this. Obviously, a runway over time will get worn down, but measurements in 1985 returned an average texture depth of just 0.37 millimeters, with some parts measuring as low as 0.19. Even the newer, coarser part of the runway had a reduced roughness. What this means is that there are significant inconsistencies. Some parts of the runway are rougher, some parts are smoother, and that will have a knock-on effect on the level of friction a landing aircraft can achieve as it moves down the runway, therefore its braking effectiveness, negatively compounded further when the runway is wet. In this case, the northern end of the runway is coarser, that is, arriving in from runway 14, then gets smoother as one travels towards the 3-2 end of the runway, which is exactly what happened to our TriStar. So now it becomes a question of establishing to what degree these runway characteristics, in addition to the wetness component, affected the TriStar on the landing rollout. Again, this braking effectiveness was something that was measurable. The investigation provided analysis based on their studies of the runway and the flight data recording to produce a graph of the accident landing's braking coefficient of friction. The average value for the TriStar here should be a braking coefficient of 0.2242. Here is what was achieved at Leeds. An abysmally poor result, far below what is expected of the plane. In fact, they only reached this value in the final 4 seconds before the aircraft went off the runway, which obviously isn't good enough. Naturally, this only serves to extend the overall runway needed for the plane to stop, which, in this case, because A, the TriStar is a big plane and naturally needs a larger runway, B, the runway it leads is short relative to the aircraft, and C, it's wet. The new distance required exceeded what was available. So there's our answer. For reasons of poor friction and a wet runway, the aircraft failed to achieve its scheduled braking effectiveness, and as a result, overran the runway. But you'll be mistaken if you think that's where this ends. You see, one can't help but think a bit more about the margins involved here. The airport, given what the TriStar needs and what is available, clearly doesn't leave a whole lot of wiggle room for a plane like this. But the aircraft had passed the UK Civil Aviation Authority's criteria for wet runway performance, and that, by extension, certified the TriStar to land at Leeds. But if we're being honest here, the airport and its runway might actually have just been a little too small under the then current conditions. No other TriStar quite had an accident like this before or since. Now, that may be because most other runways the TriStar would normally operate on globally were longer than the one it leads. In fact, based on the 169 airports that were in the British Airtours operating manual, literally every other runway except one was longer than runway 14. Now, this is beside the point from me, but I was wondering. The investigation didn't specify what that other shorter runway was, but I do have a slight hunch as to what it could have been. However, given the elevation situation, Leeds Bradford being situated at roughly 650 feet above sea level, the air pressure component effectively did make this the shortest runway the TriStar would use. That means all of those other runways allowed for more favourable margins, more wiggle room, if you will. So, for the investigation, they were now left questioning the validity of the CAA's certification process and why the TriStar was even here in the first place. Back in 1972, the TriStar was undergoing various certifications before entering normal service. That year, the British Civil Aviation Authority for the TriStar certification in the United Kingdom performed wet runway trials at Boeing Field in Seattle, employing a reference method. Using the 3,000-meter concrete runway in Seattle, they artificially wetted the runway to closely match the CAA's reference wet hard surface. They took friction measurements from the runway and performed a number of test landings and rejected takeoffs to calculate a braking coefficient of friction value for the TriStar, that being 0.2242, that is this line on our chart here. The results of these wet runway trials were accepted and adopted, folding the wet runway performance into the broader UK certification that ultimately rated the TriStar to land at many commercial airports in the United Kingdom, which apparently may also have included Gibraltar, an airport known for its precariously short runway. This may even serve to highlight the TriStar's rather unique role in British aviation. Most of the big planes of the era flew into London or Manchester, but by the mid-1980s, millions more people outside of these centres could afford air travel and package holidays. But when you live 300 kilometres away, Heathrow is not your local airport. It could be places like Leeds or Newcastle or, heaven forbid, Teesside. In order to serve multiple hundreds of holidaymakers at a time, you need a bigger plane, and a lot of these TriStars were used for holiday charters. At the same time, most of those provincial airports are small with shorter runways. Nevertheless, there is that belief and trust that the aircraft's wet runway performance was valid, therefore raised no immediate concerns. It was only after this accident that the investigation found two major shortcomings in these original trials. For one thing, the runway friction measurements that were taken were done using a different vehicle and trailer compared to the CAA's reference wet hard surface, and those measurements were found to have greater influence over the results. Additionally, the findings of a 1979 report by the Ministry of Defence revealed that the Boeing Field runway tended to produce more friction than what is reflected at UK airports. If they had used the same equipment, they may have discovered that. And here's the thing, these weren't the only wet runway trials done with the TriStar. A year later, in 1973, the US Federal Aviation Administration were out conducting runway tests in Roswell, New Mexico, and specifically they were testing this brand new plane of the era, Concorde. It was a special landing requirement certification that the FAA needed, and they ultimately forbid the plane to fly over American soil on account of the problems that a supersonic airliner brings. But incidentally, the FAA at the same time decided to run further wet runway trials on the Boeing 737 and the Lockheed TriStar. Compared to the CAA's original 1972 testing, the Roswell trials involved more flights, assessing the impact of various depths of water on the runway that changed from flight to flight, and in terms of texture, the runway in Roswell appeared to more closely resemble the one at Leeds Bradford. The results of the Roswell trials were telling. Even with just a small amount of water, the TriStar could achieve less than half the braking effectiveness it was supposed to. If we return to our graph, plotting out the Roswell trials, we can see for ourselves that it was more or less consistent with what investigators found at Leeds. This prompted the Air Accidents Investigation Branch to inform the CAA of their findings. The authorities' 1972 runway trials may have fallen short for the TriStar's performance on UK runways, as far as the AAIB was concerned anyway. But the Civil Aviation Authority appeared to disagree, giving little credence to the report by the Ministry of Defence and the results of the Roswell trials. Despite this, investigators still found themselves questioning the validity of the TriStar's wet runway certification by the CAA, concluding in their final report that the friction available on the runway at Leeds was lower than what was needed in wet weather, and that the wet runway performance of the TriStar may not be valid. The Air Accidents Investigation Branch issued a number of safety recommendations, most of which were aimed at the UK Civil Aviation Authority. They called for the CAA to review its reference wet hard surface to reflect higher standards of friction, and to that end, they called for a review of the wet runway performance of not just the TriStar, but all aircraft that were certified using the CAA's reference wet hard surface. The runway at Leeds Bradford Airport was to receive further examination to ensure suitable friction in wet conditions. Since the accident, it has been overhauled, being fully resurfaced with grooved concrete. As a matter related to the runway, investigators also cautioned broader aviation authorities on the effects that initial downslopes can have on aircraft landing performance. These slopes are now identified and clearly marked. After the accident, British Airtours ceased TriStar operations at Leeds Bradford, though other airlines did fly them in on occasion. Larger planes in general these days are a rare sight at the airport. There hasn't been a regular widebody service here for years. Leeds Bradford today, though, is perhaps most known as being the home of Jet 2. Nothing beats a Jet 2 holiday! Finally got it right in the end. But what about our TriStar? What happened to the plane? Well, believe it or not, Golf Bravo Bravo Alpha India was repaired at Leeds and was returned to normal service. However, the British Airtours brand was not long for this world. In 1987, British Airways was privatised, and one of their first major moves was to acquire British Caledonian, a competitor airline to BA that was based out of Gatwick and directly competed with Airtours on holiday routes. The airline then merged those two operations together, creating Caledonian Airways. So, to be clear, these were two different airlines by the end of it. British Airways transferred the Airtours TriStars over to Caledonian, where they continued to fly for over 10 years, flying in and out of UK airports without any problems. Mainly Gatwick, Manchester, Birmingham, airports with big runways. Alas, in 1995, British Airways sold Caledonian to an independent tour operators group. For several years around the turn of the millennium, the airline and its fleet changed hands multiple times, with mergers and rebrands, which eventually resulted in the creation of Thomas Cook Airlines in 2003. That said, the TriStars did not make it that far. Caledonian started offloading and retiring the TriStars in the late 1990s. A few were sold to other airlines like Classic Airways, another UK holiday airline, but by 1999, these planes as a whole globally were aging and were on the way out. The dated airplane of the 1970s was being replaced by newer twin-engine widebodies that were more fuel efficient, featured digital flight decks, GPS, and modern amenities. For example, in-flight entertainment had come a long way in the 1990s. While newer planes were installing personalized displays, many TriStars still had old video systems and projectors, and I certainly cannot wait to infodump to you about all of that. Antiquated was a good way to describe it. Golf Bravo Bravo Alpha India made its final passenger revenue flight on May 5, 1999, London Gatwick to the Greek island of Rhodes. The plane did not exactly get the send-off it probably deserved, as it suffered a very hard landing at Rhodes, which resulted in the plane being pulled from service. Caledonian Airways, instead of repairing the plane, ferried it to Abu Dhabi and abandoned her there. Our fabled plane just sat there in the blistering heat for 6 months, awaiting her fate. She was scrapped in November 1999, bringing the story of that curious plane crash in Yorkshire to a close. Hello everyone, thank you so much for watching this video and for making it all the way through to the end. If you enjoyed this one, be sure to drop a like right now, and if you are new here, don't forget to subscribe on your way out so you won't miss my next video. I can't believe it, this video started off as a bit of a conversation in my Discord server. By the way, if you haven't joined my Discord, I will leave a link to that below this video. But yeah, this video sprouted from a conversation in there. Basically, I really wanted to make a video about the TriStar now that we got a new model in the flight simulator. But it turns out I had already made videos about the major TriStar cases already, so here we are. I hope you liked it. It certainly surprised me. Anyway, it is that time. It is time to take a moment to thank my incredible patrons over on Patreon for their generous support to the channel. Their names are scrolling on the screen right now, so if you do see your name here, a massive thanks goes out to you. As always, we have a number of folks to shout out, beginning with the new business class tier patrons. So a thank you goes out to Heather Reynolds, Andres Morrill, Philip Hindle, and Restless Hermit. Thank you all so much. And of course, we cannot forget the new first class tier patrons who have pledged at the highest tier. A massive thanks to Baby Roger and Noah Baldwin. What absolute legends. A big thank you to all of my patrons. Thank you. If you yourself would like to support the channel further, you can always join the Disaster Breakdown Patreon from just £1 per month, and the link to that will be in the pinned comment below. All patrons get early access to all the new videos 2 days before they go out publicly. And if you want to keep up with me and my own ongoings, these days I am most active in my Discord community server, so please feel free to come join me on there. The invite link will be in the pinned comment along with my other social media. With all of that said, it is finally time for me to shut the hell up. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time. Bye!